Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program. This is the Lunchtime Discovery Series. It's good to be with you all for another edition of our program, of our weekly opportunity to meet interesting people doing interesting work out there in the world of science, nature, education, art, all kinds of fun and interesting disciplines. My name is Chris Smith. I'm the coordinator for current science programming here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and I will be your host for our program today. Now, the Lunchtime Discovery Series is brought to you by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality. They coordinate and organize the program, and it's a broadcast service by us here at the Museum of Natural Sciences, two state government institutions working together to bring you something good and important every single week. It's hard to believe, but folks, we make it happen every week right here at our program. Now, because we do bring you this program live and right here on social media, on YouTube and on Facebook, that means we want it to be interactive. After the presentation with today's guest speaker, you have the chance to ask your questions. All you've got to do is type them up into the chat on YouTube, post them in the comments on Facebook. If you're active on Twitter, you can even post them there. Use the hashtag Lunchtime Discovery. We're watching all of the platforms, and we can make sure that we get your comments and questions to today's guest speaker after the program, which, all month long here at the program, we've been celebrating Earth Month. That's right. Just last Friday, we celebrated Earth Day, or at least I hope you celebrated Earth Day. I did. I took lots of selfies outside because that's just one of the ways that I celebrate, but also took the opportunity to get outside, do a little reading about improving humanity's impact on the planet and ways that we can help to make this Earth a better place, not just for us, but for all of the living things with which we share it. And I think today's guest speaker is also thinking about Earth Day and Earth Month activities. In fact, things that humanity can do all year round, all the time, to make the Earth a better place for all living things. Dr. Ron Sutherland is the chief scientist for the Wildlands Network, and he joins me now. Hi, Ron.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for being here and presenting today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Yeah, it's exciting.
Did you do anything special for Earth Day?
Oh gosh, we went out to the Eno River State Park and found some snakes, kind of over the weekend, not on the thing, but yeah, I think we found 21 snakes in a day over there.
Oh,
cool.
Wow, yeah, that's a good day. Although I would imagine at a place called the Wildlands Network, like every day is Earth Day.
Yeah. We
trademarked, right? Every day is Earth Day at the Wildlands.
We work pretty hard. Yeah.
Well,
sure.
I'm excited for your presentation today and to learn a little bit more about this Half Earth idea and what Wildlands Network is up to.
Cool. Should I get started?
Let's do it.
All right. Here we go. Share screen. There we go. From the beginning. Good. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Chris, for that introduction, and for the privilege of being here today. It's nice to actually come full circle. I actually was a junior curator at the museum way back in the day, pre-pandemic, let's say, and so it's nice to be here giving a talk at the museum. But before I dive in, let me start with an audacious claim, which is that my neighborhood has a superpower when it comes to biodiversity. And from the street, it looks pretty normal, like any other suburb in the Triangle. No, that's not my real neighborhood. But if you look behind the houses in our street, we've actually got this creek floodplain that the beavers have been busy flooding into a series of wetlands. And those beaver swamps are connected to New Hope Creek, which goes right down to the middle of this slide here. And New Hope Creek connects Duke Forest down to Jordan Lake, and the game lands around Jordan Lake, and all the forest around Jordan Lake shown here. And then all that forest is connected by the Cape Fear River all the way down, past Wilmington out towards, Carolina Beach and Bald Head Island. And there's lots of natural areas along the way. So my neighborhood is connected to all of that. And as a result, our the forest behind our house is just chock full of cool wildlife. And not to brag, but we've recorded so far, and about 7 years. What do we got? 14 species of amphibians, 23 species of reptiles, including 6 species of nesting turtles in our yard, 2 of which showed up yesterday. 19 mammals, river otters, mink, and 76 birds, which is probably limited more by my birding capabilities than by the number of birds. But local habitats connected to larger habitats, a nice blend of human and natural worlds, that is the key to maintaining at least some biodiversity in our part of the world. And the same thing is true across the planet. I think the case can be made. So speaking of planets, our neighborhood also has its own kryptonite when it comes to wildlife, and that's roads and cars. And South Durham, where I live, has this mix of wildlife-laden creek corridors and then very busy roads that intersect those corridors. And the result is just huge numbers of roadkill and a whole lot of really fat, happy vultures, actually. And on my little street, we've seen firsthand the marbled salamanders bravely making a go of crossing the road, every October on rainy nights. And we do our best to help them across, but still a number of them get squashed. And we have to look for solutions to help these animals get across the roads. And the other thing that's going on in South Durham, and this picture is actually from South Carolina in the Francis Marion National Forest, but same idea, is that we're rapidly losing our blocks of forest as more and more neighborhoods get built, more and more people move in to claim their slice of North Carolina quality of life. And as that balance tips towards a more human-dominated landscape, I'm sure we're going to keep losing more and more native species unless we quickly ramp up our efforts to protect green space. So that, in a nutshell, is my talk. We've got to protect more habitats to prevent local and global extinctions. We've got to make sure those habitats are connected so that wildlife can flow back and forth and thrive, and ideally without getting massacred on highways in the process. So let me step back for a moment and tell you a little bit about Wildlands Network. We're a conservation nonprofit dedicated to restoring, reconnecting, and rewilding nature across North America so that all life can thrive. And we've always been known for thinking at grand scales, for putting the landscape and then the continent into the conservation conversation when it comes to protecting nature and saving species. And I've been with Wildlands since 2010 here in our Durham office, and I've been involved in a number of campaigns that the folks here in North Carolina may be familiar with. For example, Hoffman Forest, we helped lead the fight with a whole lot of other folks to save the 79,000 acres of forest down at the coast back when NC State University was thinking about selling those to a corn farmer. And we won that one with the help from all kinds of energetic people. And we're also one of the leading groups working to save the critically endangered red wolf down at the coast as well. And we just got the happy news last week, actually basically on Earth Day, that the first litter of wild red wolf pups had been born since 2018, which is finally a note of hope in the fate of that species. And then further west in the mountains with a bunch of other groups, including National Parks Conservation Association, we are helping lead an effort to look at Interstate 40 and where to put wildlife road crossings along that highway where it wraps around Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And we're doing all kinds of different research techniques up there to pinpoint where the best places to put wildlife crossings would be on that stretch of highway, which is cuts off all the biodiversity in the park from moving northwards. So that's kind of in a nutshell the sort of things I get to do with my job. I really love it. Get to be realistic and straightforward when it comes to saving nature and what it is we have to do to protect biodiversity in North Carolina and beyond. Back though to the big picture, let's talk about HalfEarth, and we'll get to my hero E.O. Wilson in a second, but we'll start with another one of my heroes, Reed Noss. And Reed Noss is a brilliant conservation biologist who was actually the first scientist at Wildlands Network back in the day. And Reed Noss and his PhD advisor, Larry Harris, were also the first folks, I think in the US really, to dream up the idea of reconnecting habitats into a functional network. And they started with the state of Florida, shown here. And their original scheme for the state of Florida is now, years later, being actively worked on with the Florida Wildlife Corridor folks. And I really think North Carolina can learn a lot from those efforts. But Reed was also hit, as he worked for Wildlands Network, he was hit with the stark reality that we needed to greatly scale up our efforts to protect the natural world if we wanted to win the fight for biodiversity. Ultimately, he called for protecting half the Earth or more in order to stave off extinctions. So a bit prescient there from Reed Noss. fast forward a bit, and Edward O. Wilson reached the same conclusion a few years later, and he developed the half-Earth concept into a book back in 2016. Rest in peace, Dr. Wilson. He just passed away this winter after a really long and incredible life. He's probably the preeminent biologist across the world. And if you haven't read his incredible books, I wholeheartedly recommend them, especially the Diversity of Life is the one that really got me hooked back when I was in high school reading this book. Just an incredible writer. And I was also fortunate enough to meet him in person a few years ago when he was in town for one of the E.O. Wilson Foundation meetings. And we had a great talk about our mutual interest in finding snakes. Anyone who ever met him knows he's just a super generous and wonderful guy. So, it's a huge loss for the world that he is gone, but we have lots of work to do to carry on his legacy. And, in his book, Half-Earth, and on the Foundation's website, Ed put forth his best arguments for an expansive, ambitious new take on saving so much more of our planet's lands and waters for the other species we share the Earth with. And there's millions and millions of species on Earth, so many that we haven't come close to identifying them all. But we're losing them quickly as humans continue to convert natural ecosystems into human-dominated landscapes, and as we continue to ruthlessly overexploit the world's oceans. So why should we consider protecting half the Earth for all the other species? Well, E.O. Wilson makes his case by drawing on his extensive observations of species living on islands of varying sizes. And he, like many other biologists before him, had a fondness for studying biology on islands because there's some really neat things you can learn. And one of those interesting things is there's a curve you can draw that predicts the number of species that an island will hold as the size of the island gets bigger and bigger or smaller and smaller. And if you plot that curve on a log scale like shown here, it actually becomes a line and a pretty precise relationship. And if you apply that species area curve to the entire Earth and then work backwards, what E.O. Wilson realized is that to save 85 or 90%, if we're feeling ambitious, of the planet's biodiversity, we had to make sure to protect 50%, shown here, of the natural habitats on the land and in the water from being destroyed or degraded or over-harvested or otherwise depopulated of native species. And so, that sounds super ambitious, but it's the scope of things. Here's a quote from Ed Wilson: "The only hope for the species still living, the ones we haven't just driven extinct already, is a human effort commensurate with the magnitude of the problem." I think that really speaks to the scale of the Half-Earth brilliant idea. And you can read more about it here on the HalfEarth Project's website. And that's a project of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. So I encourage you to check them out as well. But yeah, it's a super ambitious idea. If anything, it's super optimistic. It's the flip side of the idea that we can get away with trashing half the planet and still, if we're lucky, save almost the entire range of biodiversity. I don't think Ed would have agreed with that statement, but let's be honest, even protecting half the Earth at this point is not going to be easy. We're up against tremendous economic forces and the material needs and desires of close to 10 billion human beings. But I said that wrong. Saving nature isn't against the interests of humanity. In fact, I think an excellent case can be made that protecting at least half of our natural ecosystems that sustain life is critical to the future health, happiness, and survival of human beings. So, those of you watching this talk right now, raise your hand if you'd like to live in a world that was at least half natural, where there was a balance between natural forests, wetlands, grasslands, healthy oceans, and the necessary footprint of humanity. I know I certainly would, and I'd like to leave such a world for my children and my grandchildren to explore someday. And it's one of the motivations for why at Wildlands Network, I actually sat down a few years ago and used the best science we had available to map out what half-Earth could look like for the Eastern United States. And we call this the Eastern Wildway. It's our optimistic vision map for the way conservation could proceed to in the future here to result in protecting a network of habitat that was suitable, we think, for saving most of the biodiversity on this part of North America. So, we need to protect half-Earth, at least, maybe more than half. And for our generation to lose this fight, to let millions of species go extinct in pursuit of short-term economic and agricultural gains is, short of nuclear war, which, I guess we can't rule out at this point, unfortunately, but it's the most unforgivable thing we could do. We owe it to our descendants to share the rich world of biodiversity with them. Their lives, our future depends on it. And I could spend the rest of my talk on the why save biodiversity, but for today, I'll just assume at the moment that you understand the logic of saving all the parts of this beautiful organic system that sustains all life on Earth. It seems a bit like a no-brainer. So let's skip ahead a bit to a very interesting follow-on question. So yes, let's protect half Earth, but which half? And I think that's a fascinating question. And of course, it's relevant to the success of trying to save the species. And the short answer is easy. We should start with protecting the best of what's left. And the remaining relatively intact ecosystems, the places where we know biodiversity is concentrated, like coral reefs, tropical rainforests, North Carolina. Yes, we have a ton of biodiversity in North Carolina. But protecting just the hotspots is not enough if the goal is to protect all of the Earth's biodiversity. We need to be systematic. We need to go ecoregion by ecoregion. And folks have mapped out all the different ecoregions of the world. And if we want to protect all the species, a lot of those species are only found in one ecoregion, so we have to protect them where they live. And some are easy, like the boreal forest or some of the deserts of the world that are still largely intact. But some are largely gone already, like the tall grass prairie in the Midwest, which is down to just a few tiny remnants of what once was a majestic sea of grass and flowers. Some ecosystems we're actively restoring, like longleaf pine, and we're actively restoring tall grass prairie too. But here in North Carolina, we're working really hard on longleaf pine restoration, trying to bring that ecosystem back. But even preserving, conserving, restoring a big piece of each ecoregion around the world isn't enough. And so it turns out that the layout and the design of these natural areas matters too. For many species, we need a network of connected habitat to help them survive. And we can't just have all these isolated blocks of nice habitat around the world, of ecosystem A, ecosystem B, and so forth. The habitats have to be connected. And it's not true for every species. Some species, like the coyote, sort of make a mockery of our efforts to contain them. And they don't seem to need our help. They can ride the subway just fine and get around and everything else. But there's a lot of species out there that aren't as resilient and wily as the coyote, and they need our help. And so let me make the case for why habitat connectivity. And first, what is it? It's simply the degree to which organisms are able to freely move across the landscape. And habitat connectivity can be really low, like on a small patch of grass in the middle of downtown Atlanta, surrounded by busy interstates and highways, or it can be really high. And here's the view from Max Patch up in the Great Smoky Mountains on the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. And there's no barriers as far as you can see. So that's what connectivity is. Why does it matter? Well, let's make the case. Some species just need way more room to roam to sort of sustain their populations. Grizzly bears and mountain lions, wolves are the poster children here. A female grizzly bear could use something like 70 square miles to raise her cubs. You can do the math. It's hard to protect a population of 500 grizzly bears or mountain lions in a single national park, given the scale of our national parks. So we have to connect multiple parks for demographic purposes. And it's true at multiple scales. At a smaller scale, you've got species like bobcats and wild turkey, rattlesnakes, pine snakes. They all use surprisingly large amounts of habitat, and they're hard to protect with a single state park or single natural area. So whether you want a population of a few hundred grizzly bears or a few hundred eastern king snakes, we need a substantial amount of habitat. And in many cases, that means we have to do our best to link the remaining fragments of natural habitat back together. Now, genetics is the next big reason why we need connectivity, and it's related to the demographic question as well. But we need to connect habitats to prevent inbreeding and maintain healthy genetics of populations. Speaking of mountain lions, the last few dozen mountain lions were down in South Florida, and they were dying out not because there was no habitat in Everglades National Park in Big Cypress, but because the population was so small, they were dying from inbreeding. They were just too isolated. And the short-term solution was to bring a few Texas mountain lions in to rescue the population genetically. But the long-term solution needs to be connecting those Florida panthers to the Texas cats via a series of subpopulations, so they can make that connection on their own. So, and in fact, the same thing's happening out in some of the smaller isolated mountain lion populations in California. And you may have just seen the news that on Earth Day last week, they did the groundbreaking for what's going to be the world's largest wildlife crossing over the super huge Highway 101 there in Los Angeles. And that's one of the big motivations for that project, is specifically to sort of rescue the genetics of the isolated mountain lions out there. Now, a third big reason to work in habitat connectivity is that species move on a seasonal or annual basis. And look at Yellowstone National Park. Again, it's not big enough for grizzly bears. It's also not even big enough to contain the ungulates, the mule deer and the elk and the pronghorn that migrate back and forth every year, or in the case of bison, they would migrate back and forth if we let them, to the higher elevations of the park in the summer and then back down again in the winter. And we've realized, as we've developed GPS tracking technology and radio tracking, that these species use such a much larger area than we thought they did. And connectivity for migrating game species is actually why this has become such a bipartisan issue. The hunters out there get it. If they want mule deer, they need to protect the mule deer migration corridors. And speaking of which, there's actually been some great new publications that have come out of USGS where they've mapped out the available data for all these different ungulate species. And so I encourage you to check out these volume 1 and volume 2 of ungulate migrations of the Western US. Tons and tons of cool maps and data in there. And then, last but not least, all kinds of species, not just charismatic megafauna, need to migrate now in response to keep up with our changing climate. And this has been true for millions of years, possibly true for billions of years. I have to go back and check whether species were able to move a few billion years ago. But it's especially true now that the human-induced pace of climate change is speeding up so fast. At the same time, we've put all kinds of barriers, cities, monoculture farms. It's going to make it so much harder for these species to keep up, for animals to keep up as the climate keeps changing. In this hemisphere, species are going to keep moving northwards, and they're going to move to higher elevations. And we've got to protect those climate migration pathways if we want these species to have a chance to survive. So that's the why. But how do we protect and restore connectivity? Well, there's four basic elements for terrestrial connectivity, and I'll get into those. For aquatic connectivity, a big part, not being an aquatic connectivity expert, I can say that it's very simple. You just have to tear down dams and fix broken culverts that are blocking the migration of fish and other aquatic animals. And this is the big Elwha River restoration project out in Washington. And I remember actually as a younger person, my father, John Sutherland, was actually involved in helping bring down some of the dams on the Neuse River that were not needed anymore. And that restored a huge amount of fish habitat along the Neuse. And so that's aquatic connectivity. There's, the barriers are pretty discrete, and we've got to work on that. For terrestrial connectivity, one principle is that where things are not broken, then don't break them. There's some places like northern Maine. This is Baxter State Park and the border with Canada. It's just forest as far as you can see. And if things are broadly permeable to wildlife already, then keep them that way. And some parts of the American West are like that. The Amazon, the Congo, sheet flow of wildlife is always better in multiple directions. It's always better than trying to protect narrow, specific wildlife corridors. Now, the next principle is, if you do need to connect some places because you're worried about that linkage, then do it as sort of broad, squat linkages and not as skinny, narrow corridors. And that's a lesson that's easily sort of forgotten in a lot of the hype about wildlife corridors these days. But the best example, one of the more prominent examples of successful corridor protection in the US is from the Pinhook Swamp project. And that's where we had Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge in Georgia, southern Georgia, and then Osceola National Forest and various other protected areas further south in Florida. And there was a gap between them, and conservationists were worried that gap, being in Florida, was going to get developed. And so what they did, they actually set out and started protecting land there. And I think there were actually up to 130,000 acres of land that's been protected in the Pinhook Swamp. And it's really basically cemented that connection between these two large core areas. And that's the way to do linkage protection at that grand scale, if you can do it. Sometimes though, that ship has sailed, and we end up needing to protect or restore relatively narrow wildlife corridors. And what a wildlife corridor is, it's a defined movement pathway that if you protect it, if you restore it, it would enable at least one species to move from point A to point B. So it's basically a highway or an interstate for one or more species of wildlife. And the idea that you can get away with protecting a narrow migration route is especially true for species where we actually have mapped out their annual migrations. This is actually the most famous wildlife migration route in the United States. This is the path of the pronghorn out there. And, in some places that path is actually pretty narrow. And so we're able to protect the migration route, at least for that species, by protecting a fairly narrow migration pathway. And animals can be surprisingly resilient. They can be persistent in trying to stay alive, to find mates, to disperse and exchange their genes back and forth between populations. And this alligator actually did make it over the fence, if you watch the video. Wildlife corridors would fit into this category of sort of narrow corridors that still work. They're often associated with creeks or river floodplains, like my backyard. If we protect those riparian corridors, we can really see the wildlife benefit. For some ecosystems, like longleaf pine or tallgrass prairie or the rainforest shown here on the Atherton tablelands of Australia, we can restore the vegetation and at the same time be restoring connectivity. And so there was a need to restore rainforest out there. And rather than just do it piecemeal, they actually decided to restore this very specific corridor between Lake Burine National Park and this larger block of rainforest on the right. And that's something that needs to be happening all over the world. We can take restoration efforts and really target them to increase habitat connectivity all over the world. So the fourth element of terrestrial connectivity is that we have to address the roads and the linear barriers, other things like railroads, the border wall down with Mexico. The busier a highway becomes, the more it poses this lethal barrier to wildlife movement. And I think people are pretty familiar with that idea. And fortunately, there are solutions. We've developed structures to help wildlife go over or under busy roads. They're called wildlife road crossings. And they work really well. They don't have to be huge. Like these are the iconic ones out in Banff National Park. But a wildlife road crossing can also look like this. This is a brand new amphibian crossing, I think up on Long Island in New York. And it probably did not cost $1 million, but it's probably going to be effective. And studies have shown that these wildlife road crossings can reduce roadkill, reduce wildlife vehicle collisions by as much as 90% when they're combined with the right kind of directional fencing that guides the animals to the right places to cross the roads. And this is actually a 10-foot tall fence that's down on US 64 for the wildlife crossings we have down there. So, and these crossings can be expensive up front, but studies have shown they actually pay for themselves, especially the large animal crossings, in terms of reducing really expensive collisions with deer and elk and moose, things like that. So a good investment. So, let's talk about North Carolina. Let's bring these high and lofty concepts of HalfEarth and habitat connectivity back to our state. How is this relevant to conservation on the ground in North Carolina? And the good news is that North Carolina has been doing a lot to protect our natural heritage, thanks to our conservation trust funds and some really generous philanthropists like Brad and Fred Standback and Tim Sweeney of Epic Games. We've really saved some special places around the state. I mean, the previous slide was Hammock Beach State Park, and this is Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. Here's the Sandhills Game Lands. I could just go on and on with pictures, but we've done a lot of conservation work in North Carolina. But in some cases, some of our protected areas are now getting pretty isolated. And Umstead State Park is one that comes to mind. It's hemmed in by urban development on many sides, and now there's a risk that even one little corner of that park is going to be blocked off even more by an expansion of a rock quarry there on the side of the park. In some cases, we've actually had some success in building connections between natural areas, and the red-cockaded woodpecker down in the Sandhills is probably the best example to give you there. Fort Bragg, big military base, has a whole lot of nice longleaf pine habitat for the woodpeckers. Sandhills Game Lands has another 60,000 acres of longleaf. And conservationists have been working for a couple decades now to really try to firm in the linkage between those two large areas. And it looks a little scattershot, but it's actually coming together pretty well. And there's still work to be done, but it gives you an example of what we can do to protect linkages in North Carolina. And here's the Eastern Wildway map that I mentioned before. This is the subset of the Eastern Wildway map that my colleague Alex put together for North Carolina. And you can see the dark orange color is places that are protected already within our vision of how a connected North Carolina could look. You can see we're making pretty good progress on that front, and there's lots of work to do. I think to properly assess how we're doing as a state, I like to put North Carolina in context with a couple other states that are about the same size, which is Florida and Alabama. They're all roughly the same size as North Carolina, but they're drastically different population sizes and drastically different rates of land conservation, as you can kind of see on this slide. Florida has for decades been spending hundreds of millions of dollars on land conservation. It's very, very, very impressive. But in part, that's because they had to, because development was speeding ahead so fast. Florida, now has twice as many people as North Carolina packed in, and they're rapidly approaching some rather crazy build-out scenarios in many parts of Florida, where every scrap of dry land that isn't protected is going to be developed. And the Florida Wildlife Corridor group is racing against the clock to try to make sure the backbone of connectivity is protected before it's too late for species like Florida panther and black bear, diamondback rattlesnakes. So lots of work down there in Florida. Alabama, sort of the other extreme, has only half as many people as North Carolina, only about 5 million people. And they are much further behind us in terms of adding public land. They're only about 6% protected. But the development pressure in rural Alabama is much lower. And they have lots and lots of privately owned farms and forests out there that are probably serving pretty well for biodiversity. In North Carolina, we're in the middle between those two states. We've got 10 million people, and we're about half as much protected land as Florida, actually a little less. But the writing is on the wall in terms of development in the mountains and development in the coasts, the Piedmont, the Sandhills, especially the Piedmont. We're going to lose just about everything if we keep going in the direction of Florida. And so far, we haven't even come close to the pace of conservation that Florida has been able to sustain. We need to be spending several $100 million each year, if not $500 million each year for the next few decades to stay even slightly ahead of the development curve. Drink the water. Ultimately, if we can use that land conservation to influence the final outcome for what North Carolina looks like in the future, we need to do that. I choke up a little bit every time I think about how close we were in the mid-2000s to passing the Land for Tomorrow $1 billion conservation bond. Imagine what that money could have gone towards protecting back then, especially right as the Great Recession was getting underway. But we could get back there, with bipartisan support. People love conservation, and especially look at what happened during the pandemic. Anyone who went outside to one of our state parks in 2020, 2021, realized just how popular things were going, how crowded the parks were. My family got turned away from parks a couple times. There were lines everywhere, and that level of crowding is going to unfortunately become the norm. I mean, it's great that people are excited about getting outside, but if we don't start ramping up our investments in green infrastructure, we're going to see more and more of this kind of crowding. And it already happens in Florida in the summer, especially a lot of their springs and other natural areas down there. So we really need to fund some serious enlargements to our natural lands portfolio. And that, it's not just public land, it could also include voluntary easements on private land as well. And to make all that sort of gel together, we really need to work on a consistent guiding framework like they've had in Florida with the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which came from the Ecological Greenways network down in Florida. And to prioritize where we're doing land conservation so that we end up with a network at the end of the day that is robust and connected and serves the need of some of these wide-ranging species. And in fact, I'd say that connectivity and wildlife corridors should probably be the big priority for the next 20 years of land conservation in North Carolina, before development robs us of too many more opportunities to make these kinds of large-scale connections. Florida is also a bit ahead of us in terms of wildlife road crossings, in part because of the regulatory demands placed on them by the endangered Florida panther. So that their state DOT in Florida got used to building wildlife crossings for Florida panthers, and that's translated into them also building crossings in other parts of the state. North Carolina only has a handful, including the crossings, 3 crossings on US 64 in Eastern North Carolina that I mentioned before, 3 nice ones there. But we do have a lot of bridges that have been replaced in the last few years, in the last couple of decades, that, because of input from the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a bunch of private citizens and groups, a lot of the bridges that have been replaced, if they're in a natural area, they've actually been expanded for wildlife. And this is the 15501 bridge over New Hope Creek. We've been studying that one for a couple of years, and it's moving thousands of deer under that bridge and other wildlife too. So we do have some functional bridges out there that aren't getting much attention. But the need is huge for wildlife and roads. And that's why Wildlands Network, we're in the process of identifying what we think are the top 20 locations for new wildlife road crossings around North Carolina. We've worked with a huge range of other wildlife biologists and wildlife conservation experts around the state to do that. But to be honest, having looked at all the options and all the input we've received from all these wildlife conservation folks, that we could actually be talking about the top 100 places to put wildlife crossings, or even the top 200 places. The need is so great, and we've divided our state up with highways so thoroughly, and with so little regard for wildlife and public safety, that we could spend a long time working on this. It's probably worth reminding that apart from humans, white-tailed deer are, I think, the most dangerous vertebrate animal in North Carolina. And this is just a map of what are mostly white-tailed deer collisions around the state in just 1 year from 2017. You can see it's a pretty widespread problem. It's going to take decades to put a dent into this problem. But fortunately, the federal infrastructure bill that just passed Congress last year included $350 million as a pilot program for wildlife road crossing projects around the country. And we've got a state and federal connectivity policy team that was working on that. And they worked really hard to make sure that money made it in there to the infrastructure bill. And so we're really proud to see that the federal government is finally dedicating money to wildlife crossings. And we hope to see this program become permanent. To access that money, it's going to be awarded on a competitive basis to the states. North Carolina needs to get its act together pretty quickly. Again, that's the motivation for our top 20 work that we're doing here in the state. And we have to be ready to advocate for places like the Pigeon River Gorge, shown here on the right with I-40, and the crossings we're identifying there. And then for red wolves, there's some red wolf roadkill hotspots, unfortunately, down there on the rest of US 64, where it goes through Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. And that's just two of the many dozens of places where we need these crossings around North Carolina. So in short, there's a lot to do in North Carolina to make sure our state protects biodiversity, reconnects our vital habitats, reconnects our landscapes. But all that work is going to pay dividends down the road in terms of keeping the state worth living in. So, to recap, where we've gone in this pretty wide-ranging talk, we need to protect way more habitat to save species from extinction. The half-Earth idea is real; it's a real concept, and it's realistic in terms of what it's going to take. If anything, it's a little optimistic about the bare minimum that we need to do if we want to sustain the life on this planet for future generations to enjoy, much less breathe in the air. And then at the same time, we need to make sure that those habitats that we're protecting are connected and into a network of habitat, especially on larger continents where that's feasible, because species need to move to survive for all the reasons I outlined: climate change, genetics, and annual migrations and things like that. So we have to make sure that the habitat that we're protecting also is connected so that these animals can keep moving. And then here in North Carolina, we have a huge need to play catch up and really ramp up the level of land conservation, water conservation efforts we're doing, so that we can get closer to protecting our own set of species that are found here in North Carolina, and so that we can make sure that we end up with a network of habitat that meets the needs of even the wide-ranging species. So I will stop there, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, everybody. Let's give Dr. Sutherland a great big round of applause, wherever you happen to be viewing from. Ron, thanks so much for sharing all of this with us.
Sure.
Folks, I'll remind you, drop your questions and thoughts into the chat. If you're watching on YouTube or the comments on Facebook, you can tweet them at us as well. Use the hashtag Lunchtime Discovery, and we can have I'm sure with the audience we've got here watching today, a nice conversation about this. I'm sure they're going to have a lot of questions once they have a moment to to process and then type them into the chat. You know, it's kind of difficult for me, Ron, having, you know, paid attention to species conservation for a little while now, to not have just a tinge of pessimism about our ability to overcome, you know, the framework for economic development in the US, which is development, and being able to set aside spaces for species and for conservation projects.
Yeah, well,
I'll start with the pessimism, and then by the end of the hour, we'll be able to ramp back up into optimism.
okay. Yeah, no. So pessimism. So most biologists I know who are concerned with conservation, you know, I think there's some quote about how ecologists live in a world of wounds. You know, we see all the damage that's done to the landscape, and we you know, it all of it hurts us deep inside. And you know, now that I've lived a good few years, you know, I've seen a lot of places in North Carolina get destroyed, and that hurts. You know, places that I may have liked to visit, or at least like to look at. And but at the same time, you know, most conservation biologists also, you sort of have to be an optimist to stay in the game, because, you know, otherwise you just, you know, you would just go sit in a corner somewhere and give up. And so, you know, I think one of the big motivations for me is to realize just, you know, on how much, you know, how to phrase this, the extent to which we are standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before us, the folks that set aside the places that we're out there enjoying every day. And, you know, the Umstead State Park that gets 1 million plus visitors every year, somebody had to protect that. Somebody had the foresight to protect that. You know, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, South Mountain State Park, DuPont State Forest. There's just so many amazing natural areas in North Carolina, and people worked really hard. They didn't give up, and they fought to make sure those places were protected. And that's a big motivating factor for me, and I'm sure other folks too, is to sort of keep that legacy going and not give up just because it looks hard. It is hard, and, you know, the pace of development is daunting. We had a little lapse there in the Great Recession, but things are certainly booming now. And you know, we've got our work to cut out for us. I think perhaps an optimistic way of framing it is, if we can better connect through the democratic process people's strong interest in nature conservation to what actually happens on the ground, then I think the will of the people is always going to be to sort of save the landscape and save our natural heritage. I think, you know, where we've run into problems is where that democratic process gets subverted a bit, and you don't see that connection.
Excellent stuff. All right. One of the first questions that came in comes from Jen. In practical terms, how are lands preserved as natural habitats? How much is government expenditure or legislation, or nonprofit expenditure, or private individual efforts?
Oh, wow. That's an excellent question. And I think I don't have the raw numbers right in front of me to really answer that precisely, but the short answer is it's a nice mix of all those things that Jen mentioned. You know, there's governments have traditionally spent a lot of money on land conservation, and, you know, there's a need to ramp that up. You know, we're happy to see that the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the Federal Land and Water Conservation Fund, got made permanent, and so that should be providing close to $1 billion a year in federal money. And various states have done conservation programs to certain degrees. You know, the state of Florida has spent something like several $1 billion over the past few decades. It actually adds up on conservation. But then, you know, you have the Nature Conservancy and other, you know, local land trusts that are out there raising money and then buying land with that money. So that's a big part of it. And then, you know, certainly not least, you have a lot of private landowners out there who are doing conservation because it's the right thing to do, and they're saving species on their land because they enjoy sharing the space with wildlife. And, you know, one of the core tasks for conservation in the United States, I think, is finding better ways to reward and incentivize those private landowners to keep doing what they're doing.
This might be, if we looked outside the United States, which Wildlands Network is working in North America. So you can dodge this question if you want to, but there are other places around the world that where the land conservation is important if they want to protect and preserve species, but they don't have the kind of like land ownership culture that's present in like Western Europe and that's, you know, now dominant in North America, where land conservation just has a different set of culture and ethics around it. You know, here we like to put fences around things and say this is protected, but in other parts of the world, is that always a viable option or the best?
Yeah, I think the answer is no. I think there's lots of models of conservation that are out there. Just heard a great talk by one of our board members yesterday about indigenous people-led conservation programs around the world, and in particular up in Canada, that are going well. And there's completely different models that are not the Western model, but involve people living in these areas. But still, for me, it comes down to, are we taking care of the other species? And if we are, then have at it. In Mexico, they have very little public protected land, and the system of land ownership is much different and much more, in some ways, much more complicated. They have lots of these communal ejido properties that are sort of large areas that are communally owned by a group of people. And so going in and buying an ejido is not something that actually happens very much. So you have to actually find ways of protecting land down there.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't heard of these. That's interesting stuff. Okay, let me grab another question from the chat for you. Are there any local efforts to create wildlife corridors besides Wildlands Network?
Yeah, we're part of one that I'm really excited to talk about. In the western part of the triangle here, there's been a group formed to focus on the Eno River and New Hope Creek corridors in sort of Durham and Orange counties. And both of those, basically they form really important wildlife or riparian corridors. New Hope Creek, connects Jordan Lake and Duke Forest. The Eno River kind of goes along the north side there and connects a lot of places. And so that group is really gaining a lot of steam. And I think we've run connectivity models, and we're looking at the transportation infrastructure and where to put wildlife crossings here in the triangle. So I encourage folks, I think if you Google it, you can find the report that came out, and then find ways of getting involved. And there's other projects around the state, but that's a good one right here.
Misty writes, we are fortunate in North Carolina to have strong support for conservation. This past year, the state budget increased funding for the NC Land and Water Fund, Parks and Recreation Trust Fund, and flood risk resilience. That's good news.
Yeah. No, I forgot to mention that part, Misty. And it's an excellent step in the right direction. And again, I think we could take maybe a triple jump in that direction and try to get ourselves up to more like $250 million a year in land conservation efforts. And again, not all of that would be buying land to make it public. A lot of that would be working with private landowners to conserve their properties. But we could spend easily that much.
Next one for you, Ron. How do we get the need for things such as wildlife crossings out to the public? I think a lot of people would be supportive if aware of the possibilities.
Yeah, well, so in some ways, I think we're better off than we ever have been, because like wildlife road crossings in particular happen to be like social media friendly, because people love the positiveness of them. They love seeing this, everybody knows about roadkill. Everybody's been, brokenhearted seeing their favorite animal dead on the road. But when you see a picture of a wildlife road crossing, especially if you see a picture of the animal going across it, it just clicks in your head. This is a positive thing that humanity could be doing. And so it's actually, I think I give social media credit for the huge surge in interest that we've seen in helping animals get across roads. So there's more to do, I think, and we're doing our best with all the partner groups that we're working with to try to spread the word about more funding for wildlife crossings and how that benefits not just the animals but driver safety and things like that too. It's a little harder, I think, to sell the idea of sort of land corridors, of protecting land to connect places, but I think a lot of folks like the Florida Wildlife Corridor group, I think, sets a gold standard for what they're doing down there. They've launched all these really successful expeditions. Folks like Carlton Ward, they've gone out there as a team and they're trekking along the Florida Wildlife Corridor to raise awareness of just how hard it would be for wildlife to make that journey. And so I would point to them as an example of how to raise awareness. And in Florida, despite some of the interesting politics going on down there, they've just made some good strides in doing more to protect the wildlife corridor stuff down there.
Scott had a related question asking, are there lessons to learn from Florida? What were the factors that promoted funding land protection and stewardship, including prescribed fire?
Yeah, well, I'm probably not qualified to talk about the differences between North Carolina and Florida in terms of prescribed fire programs, but my understanding with Florida is just that back in the 80s, probably they realized, maybe in the 70s before that, they realized where things were going, and so they had that moment of prescience and foresight, and they could see what was going to happen if they didn't get busy protecting the landscape, because the advent of air conditioning post World War II made Florida suddenly look attractive to all these people as a retirement venue. And so they could see where that was going to go. And I think, if we're not seeing that in North Carolina right now, then we're not paying attention. We need to look around and see where things are going. And so we need our state leaders to wake up to this possibility that if they don't get busy doing the conservation that we need, then 30 years from now, North Carolina's gonna be a mess. And we don't want that. So it's time to really get serious about how we're gonna protect our natural landscape.
What are the primary factors used to determine where your selected priority areas and corridors are? Do you have a method for assessing habitat quality in them?
Oh gosh, that's kind of a whole separate talk. So I won't be to go too far into it. But the good news is there's lots of different connectivity science approaches that are out there right now. The Nature Conservancy has been mapping resilient areas for conservation across the entire continent, and so we use their data where we could get it, and the Wilderness Society has been mapping corridors between large protected areas and wilderness areas, and so we use their data. And so our approach at Wildlands has been, so far, we do some of our own modeling with connectivity. We try to predict where species will go based on what we know about how they use habitat. But then we're also quite happy to use other people's science data as well and try to combine that all into a fairly robust evidentiary layer of support.
So folks who might be interested in this, folks who want to take an active role in supporting wildlife corridors and protecting habitats, what are the first steps for those people? Is it to send Ron Sutherland an email? Is it to start going to town hall meetings? What's that look like?
Oh gosh, I think getting active is definitely the first step, and getting more information. You can feel free to check out our website, wildlandsnetwork.org. There's other great websites out there, and I'm happy to share some links after the talk that we can share around. But mostly I think it's wake up to this idea that we can still. It's not too late. We actually can still connect the natural world in North Carolina, across the United States, but it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of energy. That the LA Cougar road crossing project is a great case example of what can happen when people get motivated, because they're raising $85 million to build a wildlife crossing over an impossibly large highway. And Beth Pratt at North National Wildlife Federation got it done, along with a whole lot of partners. So, if there's a particular place that needs a wildlife crossing in North Carolina, if somebody wants to take it on and make it their baby, then jump on it. Go for it, because the powers that be often, they don't like to take action on things until somebody makes them. But if folks out there want to get busy and help us make the case for any of these corridors, road crossings, etc., I think the sky's the limit on citizen engagement.
Excellent stuff. Ron, thanks for being on the program today and sharing the work that you're involved in with us.
It's been fun. Thanks for having me on. Yeah.
Really appreciate it. Great stuff. And we had a great audience tuned in. These were excellent questions that everybody had. So I'm glad that we could bring this conversation to everybody as part of our Earth Month series.
No, folks, it's been great. Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
All right. Let's see here. Next week, everybody, we will be back again next Wednesday at noon with another edition of the Lunchtime Discovery series. We're going to be talking about a new project here in North Carolina called the Carolina Ghost Hunt. We will not be exploring paranormal activity unless you just think that fireflies are paranormal. That's right. We're going to be talking about a new community science project that's a collaboration between local scientists and us here at the Museum of Natural Science called the Carolina Ghost Hunt. You don't want to miss out. That's next Wednesday at noon here at the Lunchtime Discovery series. All the information will be available online on social media, on the museum's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. You can also find it at the Office of Environmental Education's website and pages. All that's going to be getting up real soon for the entire month of May. Another great month of programs that we've got coming up for you. So stay connected, stay active, and I hope that we'll see you again real soon here on the Lunchtime Discovery series. Bye, everybody.